World War II is full of secrets, but this one is different. In 1943, dozens of soldiers vanished in a way that defied explanation. Official records downplay it. Eyewitnesses were silenced, and the files were buried deep in classified archives. But fragments of the truth still remain, and tonight we're putting the pieces together. You won't believe where this trail leads. The year was 1943, and the world was already drowning in blood, fire, and chaos. Yet even in a time when millions marched to battle and thousands died each day, there are some stories so strange, so utterly baffling, that they refuse to vanish into the dust of history. Among them lies one of the most haunting mysteries of the Second World War, a story whispered in war rooms, written in half-burned diaries, and hidden in military archives. The story of the soldiers who marched into the wilderness in 1943 and never returned. Men who carried rifles, maps, and orders but somehow dissolved into silence, leaving behind no trace but fear, rumors, and unanswered questions. This is not just a story of war. It is a story of disappearance, of shadows swallowing entire units, and of a mystery that still unsettles historians to this day. Where did those men go? What swallowed them whole? The answers remain buried, but tonight we step into the fog of 1943 to follow their fading footprints. The mystery begins not with a bang, but with the scratching of pens across military ledgers. In early March 1943, reports from multiple fronts told of missing groups of soldiers' units that had been accounted for in 1 week. Roll call, but had vanished by the next. Not slaughtered in battle, not captured by the enemy, but simply gone. To military officials, the reports looked like clerical errors. After all, the war machine devoured men so quickly that keeping perfect track was impossible. But when the same pattern emerged in 3 different regions, North Africa, the Pacific Islands, and even the snowy borders of Eastern Europe, whispers began. Too many men, too many missing, and too few explanations. In the desert of Tunisia, the Allied command struggled to maintain supply lines under German attack. 1 battalion, the 2nd Essex, was ordered to secure a stretch of barren land dotted with ridges and old Roman ruins. The desert was unforgiving. Wind tore through canvas tents, and sand seeped into rations, rifles, and lungs. Yet the Essex marched on. According to the regimental diary, on the morning of March 12, 1943, over 400 men reported for duty. By the next roll call, 2 full companies, nearly 150 soldiers, failed to appear. No gunfire had been heard in the night. No enemy movements were reported. Patrols scoured the dunes, but found only abandoned rifles, footprints that led nowhere, and a single mess tin left cooling in the sand. The men had simply vanished. Some officers claimed it was a desert mirage, men disoriented and scattered. Others whispered of ambushes, hidden caves, or betrayal. But no bodies were recovered, no prisoners ever surfaced, and no one could explain how 150 men could disappear under the open desert sky without leaving behind so much as a body. Half a world away on a tiny Pacific island barely known to the maps, American forces logged a disappearance eerily similar. A company of engineers assigned to build airstrips reported to base at dawn. By dusk, they were gone. Their tents stood neatly arranged, their tools stacked in rows, their half-finished runways glistening in the sun. But of the men themselves, over 80 engineers, there was no sign. Radios picked up no distress calls, no reports of attack, and no footprints leading into the jungle. When reinforcements combed the island, they found a strange silence. Parrots screeched in the trees, waves crashed on the shore, but no trace of human struggle lingered. No broken branches, no spilled blood, just emptiness. The jungle had swallowed the engineers whole. Weeks later, scattered bones would wash up on the beach, picked clean by crabs. But whether those remains belonged to the missing men or to older, forgotten victims of some other war, no one could say. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, where snow and fire turned villages into ash, a Soviet unit tasked with holding a frozen riverbank recorded one of the most chilling disappearances of all. On April 2, 1943, Commissar Alexei Vasiliev received word that 120 men had gone missing overnight. The river, frozen and silent, showed no signs of crossing. The forests bore no tracks, no disturbed snow. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed the soldiers. Local peasants muttered of cursed ground, of spirits haunting the river from centuries past. Yet, when Soviet investigators arrived, they found something even stranger. In the barracks, the men's coats still hung neatly. Rifles stood stacked in corners. Their dinner, boiled potatoes and black bread, remained uneaten, frost clinging to the crusts. The soldiers had left mid-meal, mid-thought, mid-life. For Vasiliev, a hardened man who had watched his comrades burn alive in tanks, it was the most terrifying thing he had ever witnessed. For he could face an enemy with bullets and steel, but how do you fight something that steals your men without a sound? What unites these cases is not just the mystery, but the silence. No one heard the gunfire of battle. No one saw the flare of artillery. There were no cries, no signals, no captured survivors dragged into camps. Just silence, and then absence. Some historians argue that the chaos of war explains it all. Perhaps these soldiers deserted, fled into the wilderness, or were quietly captured in raids that went unrecorded. Others suggest more sinister possibilities. Special operations by enemy forces, secret massacres covered up by command, or experimental weapons designed to erase without trace. But to the families who waited, to the comrades who woke to find their bunks empty, these theories brought little comfort. What mattered was that men had vanished in the prime of their youth, swallowed by the year 1943, leaving behind questions that no general, no politician, and no priest could answer. The records we have are fragmentary, often censored or conflicting. The British War Office listed the 2nd Essex losses as missing, presumed captured. The U.S. military archives mark the engineers as Mia likely drowned in storm. The Soviet files speak of unauthorized withdrawal into forest terrain. But each of these explanations feels thin, stretched like paper over a chasm. They do not answer the core question. How could trained soldiers vanish without a fight, without bodies, without a single surviving witness? And so the legend of the lost soldiers of 1943 grew. In barracks and trenches, men whispered about them at night. Some said they walked into the desert and never came back. Others claimed the jungle devoured them. A few spoke of portals, curses, or experiments the government never admitted to. Soldiers laughed nervously at these tales, but in their eyes lingered the fear that perhaps, just perhaps, tomorrow it might be them. Even now, 80 years later, historians argue. Was it desertion, disaster, or something darker? Tonight, we follow the trail of those men, from Tunisia's dunes to the jungles of the Pacific, to the frozen rivers of the East. We will examine the diaries, the dispatches, the rumors, and the silences. And we will ask the question that haunted 1943. Where did they go? To truly understand the vanishing of these men, we need to step into the world of 1943 itself, a year suspended between despair and hope, when the war's outcome still trembled on a knife's edge. By then, entire nations had already been shattered. The blitzkrieg that once seemed unstoppable had begun to falter, yet victory was far from certain. Cities burned across Europe. The Pacific was scattered with graves beneath the waves. In North Africa, men fought over barren stretches of desert as though they were fields of gold. And in the frozen East, millions of soldiers froze, starved and bled in battles so brutal they barely seemed human. In such a climate with chaos in every corner, is it really so strange that men might vanish without trace? Or is the strangeness precisely that anyone noticed at all? For the men on the ground, 1943 was not defined by sweeping maps or grand speeches, but by the constant rhythm of fear, exhaustion, and confusion. Orders often arrived late, garbled by poor communication. Units marched through blinding fog, navigated by half-broken compasses, or staggered across deserts with maps that had not been updated in decades. Soldiers often did not even know where they were, let alone where the enemy lay. It was a world of half-seen shapes, distant echoes, and rumors passed from one foxhole to the next. Against this backdrop, disappearances became more than battlefield tragedies. They became campfire legends. In the desert, the case of the missing Essex men spread rapidly. Some soldiers swore they had seen strange lights flickering over the dunes the night the battalion vanished, blue flames, like lanterns moving in silence. Others whispered of Bedouin raiders, shadows on horseback, who could spirit away men before dawn. Yet when scouts followed the supposed tracks, they ended in circles, as though deliberately erased by the wind. The more pragmatic officers offered a different theory. The men had mutinied. Exhausted, hungry, and disillusioned, perhaps they had abandoned their posts, striking out across the desert in search of escape. But mutiny leaves traces, angry scrawls in diaries, desertion notes, arguments overheard. None of these were found. Instead, the soldiers' journals spoke of normal things: missing letters from home, frustration with rations, longing for rest. Not one entry hinted at an organized plan to flee. The Pacific disappearance was even more unsettling. Engineers, not combat troops, were unlikely to desert. They had been building runways, laying steel plates, and carving through coral when they vanished. Their commanding officer, Colonel James Forrester, filed a frantic report. It is as though the men walked into the trees and dissolved. Reinforcements arriving by boat found the island eerily untouched. Coconut shells still lay cracked in fire pits. Shovels stood plunged into the soil, and half-built airstrip beams stretched out like skeletal arms toward the sea. But of human presence, nothing remained. Even the dogs that had accompanied the engineers were gone. Forrester described the island as eerily still, unnaturally quiet, as though time had stopped. Later, investigators suggested the men may have fallen victim to disease or to a Japanese raiding party. But why then had they not cried out, fired weapons, or left signs of struggle? Why had their supplies been left untouched, their radios still working? To this day, the island's fate remains a dark blot in military records. The Soviet case, though, remains the most chilling, not least because of what the investigators left out of their official reports. Diaries uncovered decades later reveal hints of something they dared not put to paper. Commissar Vasiliv, writing in his private notes, described hearing strange noises the night before the soldiers vanished. It was like singing, he wrote, but not of human throats. A low hum carried across the frozen air as if the river itself was singing. Villagers nearby reported strange lights, two soft glows beneath the ice, like lanterns moving in water. In the morning, when the soldiers were gone, the villagers claimed they had been taken by the river. Of course, Soviet officials dismissed such tales as peasant superstition, but the eerie silence of that riverbank lingers in every account. Not a drop of blood, not a scrap of clothing, just neat bunks, half-eaten meals, and absence. What do these stories have in common? Silence. No signs of struggle. No enemy weapons left behind. No frantic messages over radio. Just sudden, complete disappearance. This silence is what terrifies us even now, because war is supposed to be loud. War is supposed to be chaos, shouting, shooting, and destruction. War devours men and fire and steel, but at least it leaves wreckage behind. What happened in 1943 breaks that rule. It suggests something quieter, something stranger, something that works not with explosions, but with erasure. This is where historians begin to divide. On one side stand the pragmatists. They argue that every disappearance has a simple explanation: lost patrols, ambushes that went unrecorded, men taken prisoner and never returned. They point out that war creates confusion. Records are unreliable. Whole units were sometimes written off in paperwork errors or listed under the wrong divisions. To them, the lost soldiers are not a mystery at all, merely the tragic result of bureaucracy meeting brutality. But then there are the others, the ones who listen closely to the soldiers' stories, to the gaps in the archives, to the strange consistency across different fronts. How could three separate armies, British, American, and Soviet, all report nearly identical vanishings in the same year, in vastly different locations? How could so many men disappear without a trace, leaving behind weapons, food, and unfinished tasks? And why do the witnesses, those who lived nearby, those who slept in nearby camps, describe lights, sounds, and silences that defy ordinary explanation? Some researchers dare to whisper of experiments. 1943 was, after all, a year of desperate innovation. Both Allies and Axis powers were racing to develop weapons unlike any seen before. Chemical gases, acoustic devices, even rumored attempts at invisibility. Could one of these experiments have gone terribly wrong, erasing not only soldiers but entire units? The so-called Philadelphia experiment conspiracy, which claims a U.S. naval vessel was teleported in 1943, feeds this suspicion. Though dismissed as myth, the parallels are difficult to ignore. Soldiers vanish in silence. A ship allegedly vanishes in silence. Coincidence or connection? Others lean toward more psychological explanations. Perhaps mass hysteria, driven by exhaustion and stress, caused groups of soldiers to break and scatter into terrain too hostile to survive. Perhaps the lights and sounds were hallucinations born of hunger, fatigue, or fever. Yet this explanation struggles against the cold facts. Hallucinations may explain fear, but they cannot explain why men never returned, why no corpses were found, why weapons and coats and meals were left untouched. And so we stand in the same place as those who lived through 1943, caught between logic and the unknown, between explanations that feel too simple and mysteries that feel too vast. What remains undeniable is that hundreds, perhaps even thousands of soldiers who should have marched home never did. Their names remain etched in stone memorials, marked simply as missing in action. But behind those words lingers a deeper truth. We do not know what happened to them. The war would continue, and the world would try to forget. But stories like these do not die. They fester, they haunt, and sometimes they resurface when least expected.
If silence is the most chilling detail of these vanishings, then the aftermath is the most revealing, because what followed each disappearance was not clarity, but confusion and sometimes deliberate cover-up. When a unit goes missing in wartime, the military machine grinds into action, search parties are dispatched, reports filed, questions asked. Yet in the case of the lost soldiers of 1943, those gears seemed to jam. Investigations were launched, but their findings were vague, contradictory, or swiftly buried. Families at home received form letters, often claiming their sons were missing in action, presumed dead. Rarely was there an effort to explain further. It was as though the armies themselves were eager to let the matter fade, to erase these men from history as cleanly as they had been erased from the battlefield. In North Africa, British command conducted aerial searches over the desert, looking for traces of the vanished battalion. Pilots scanned for tracks, wreckage, or bodies. Nothing. They found only endless dunes, shifting like waves in a sea of sand. Later, a single rumor emerged. A downed German reconnaissance plane had allegedly intercepted a radio message half garbled that spoke of movement in the sand. But no transcript survives, and when pressed, the War Office dismissed the story as invention. Even so, whispers circulated that the soldiers had stumbled upon something not meant to be seen, perhaps an enemy installation or secret test. If true, then perhaps their disappearance was not an accident, but an intentional erasure. In the Pacific, the Americans were less discreet. Colonel Forrester demanded answers, pushing his superiors for reinforcements and forensic teams. What he got instead was silence. Weeks later, the case was classified. The official narrative shifted. The engineers were lost during enemy engagement. Yet no such engagement existed in the records. No Japanese attack, no skirmish, not even enemy radio chatter. The engineers were simply gone. Soldiers stationed nearby joked nervously that the island was cursed, that it swallowed men whole. Forrester himself never spoke of it again. He retired after the war and lived in isolation, refusing interviews. Though neighbors later claimed he sometimes woke screaming in the night, the Soviet case was the most ruthlessly suppressed. Stalin's regime tolerated no mysteries, only narratives that served the state. The missing company was written off as deserters, branded traitors to the motherland. Families were told their sons had abandoned their posts, a death sentence even in absence. But rumors traveled fast in villages, and villagers whispered of what they had seen: lights beneath the ice, strange hums in the river, patrols that vanished without even leaving footprints. A handful of defectors later carried these stories west, where they fed into Cold War conspiracy theories of secret Soviet experiments. Was it propaganda, or an echo of something real? The silence from officials did not stop speculation among the rank and file. Soldiers are natural storytellers. In the long hours between battles, tales are currency, and the lost soldiers of 1943 became the richest coin of all. Around campfires, men traded versions of the story. In some, the desert battalion had walked into a mirage that turned real, stepping into another world. In others, the Pacific engineers had uncovered something ancient beneath the soil, something their superiors wanted hidden. As for the Soviets, their tale became a ghost story told to recruits. Beware the singing river. It takes those who linger to close. But behind folklore lurked something more unsettling. Because occasionally, fragments of evidence did surface just enough to tantalize, never enough to prove. A British officer reportedly kept a torn page from a missing soldier's diary, found weeks later drifting in the desert. It contained a single line: "The sand is moving again." In the Pacific, a crate of rations bearing the engineer's unit number washed ashore hundreds of miles away. Its contents were untouched, as though it had been sealed and abandoned. And in the Soviet Union, a villager decades later produced a strange metal fragment from the riverbank. Unlike any known military equipment, it was confiscated immediately, and she was warned never to mention it again. These fragments fuel the theories that swirl around the mystery even now. Some claim natural phenomena are to blame. The desert is notorious for sandstorms so fierce they can bury entire convoys in minutes. Could the battalion have been swallowed alive, their bodies hidden beneath dunes that later shifted again, erasing every trace? The Pacific is home to sudden typhoons and treacherous currents. Perhaps the engineers were swept out to sea, and the Soviet wilderness is a labyrinth of ice and rivers, capable of devouring men without mercy. But while nature is cruel, it usually leaves traces: broken weapons, torn uniforms, washed up bodies. Here, there was nothing. Others insist human hands were at work. Secret operations, perhaps, or covert experiments. 1943 was rife with both. The Allies tested radar, so advanced it seemed to see through walls. The Germans experimented with sound weapons, capable of vibrating flesh. The Japanese pursued biological warfare in secret laboratories. Could one of these projects have touched the lost soldiers? Perhaps they were unwilling test subjects, or witnesses silenced by their own governments. The classification of reports and the eagerness to declare cases closed suggests something more than bureaucratic error. Perhaps the real disappearance was not of men, but of truth. Then there are those who step beyond science entirely. For them, the vanishings are evidence of something otherworldly. Aliens, time slips, interdimensional rifts, ideas that sound absurd until one considers the consistency of the accounts. Strange lights, humming sounds, sudden silence. These motifs recur across cultures, across decades. Could 1943 have been a year when something broke through? When the chaos of war created cracks wide enough for the unknown to slip in? Whatever the explanation, one fact remains: the lost soldiers of 1943 never returned. Their families never buried them. Their comrades never saw them again. And their governments, rather than illuminate the mystery, chose to bury it deeper. That silence, that refusal to explain, is itself a kind of answer, an admission that something occurred which even the war-scarred world of the 1940s could not accept. But history has a way of surfacing. Documents declassified decades later reveal gaps where files should be. Pages blacked out with ink. Memos stamped top secret. Inquiries reopened in the 1960s stumbled upon missing boxes of evidence. When pressed, archivists shrugged, lost in reorganization, convenient to convenient. The truth, it seems, remains as carefully hidden as the soldiers themselves. And yet, the mystery refuses to die. Today, historians, conspiracy theorists, and families of the missing all chase the same question: not just where these men went, but why the world was so quick to forget them. Because forgetting is the final disappearance. As long as we ask, they remain half shadows, half memory, but not gone. Perhaps that is why their story still grips us. Not because it offers answers, but because it reminds us of the questions we are too afraid to ask. If the story of the lost soldiers ended with silence, it might simply be another unsolved wartime tragedy. But the silence was only the beginning. Over the decades that followed, strange echoes of 1943 began to surface: new accounts, fresh disappearances, and eerie patterns that seemed to repeat themselves, as though history itself were stuck in a loop. And with each new piece of evidence, the mystery deepened, pulling researchers, veterans, and conspiracy theorists into a labyrinth of unsettling possibilities. One of the most striking echoes came from the deserts of North Africa, decades after the war had ended. In 1959, a team of French surveyors stumbled upon a cluster of rusted rifles buried beneath the sand. Their serial numbers traced back to a British regiment, one that had supposedly been lost 16 years earlier. Yet there were no bones, no uniforms, no bodies, just weapons, arranged almost deliberately, as though placed there by unseen hands. The discovery was hushed up at first, but word eventually leaked, fueling speculation that the soldiers had indeed been swallowed by the desert, only not in the way people imagined. How could weapons survive? but men vanish completely. Unless, of course, the weapons were meant to be found. In the Pacific, the echoes were even stranger. Fishermen on the Solomon Islands claimed that in the late 1940s, they had encountered a group of pale, ragged men on a remote shore. They spoke no recognizable language and disappeared into the jungle when approached. Years later, anthropologists studying the region reported hearing legends from islanders about men from the sky who appeared during the war and then vanished without a trace. The descriptions of their clothing tattered khaki, strange boots bore an uncanny resemblance to U.S. Army uniforms of the era. Could some of the missing engineers have survived, stranded in feral, far from the world that had forgotten them? Or were these simply stories reshaped by time and myth? As for the Soviet disappearance, whispers lingered in the shadows of the Cold War. In 1967, a retired officer reportedly told a journalist about a file he had once seen, locked in a Ministry of Defense vault. The file contained sketches of symbols supposedly carved into trees near the vanished encampment, symbols that did not match Cyrillic, German, or any known alphabet. The officer was silenced soon after, and the journalist's article was never published. But fragments of the story persisted, carried through rumor, finding their way into samizdat pamphlets and Western intelligence briefings. Some suggested the symbols were ancient, perhaps Slavic runes. Others hinted at something not of this earth. Either way, they hinted that the men had not simply fled or frozen, they had been marked. These echoes kept the mystery alive, but they also revealed something deeper, that the disappearances had become more than historical curiosities. They had become part of a psychological landscape, shaping how soldiers, civilians, and even governments thought about war itself. Because the question was not only where did they go, but also why does this frighten us so much? The answer lies in the nature of disappearance. Death, for all its finality, is at least an explanation. A body, a grave, even a name on a memorial offers closure. But disappearance denies that comfort. It leaves a wound open forever, festering in uncertainty. Families of the lost soldiers received telegrams that read "missing in action." But those 3 words were a sentence without an ending. They did not know whether to grieve or to hope. They were caught in an eternal waiting room, their lives suspended. This is the psychological terror of the lost soldiers, not only that they were gone, but that their absence left a void too vast to fill. The soldiers who remained were haunted in a different way. To march alongside comrades one day and find them gone the next is to confront the fragility of existence. Veterans spoke of the vanishings in hushed tones, not just because they feared official reprimand, but because they feared what the stories meant. If men could vanish without bullets, without bombs, without screams, then what safety was left in the world? War already taught them that life was fragile, but this taught them something worse, that reality itself might be fragile too. Governments, of course, had their own reasons for burying the stories. The image of soldiers vanishing into thin air was not only unsettling, it was destabilizing. Armies depend on trust, on the belief that leaders know what is happening and have control. To admit ignorance, to confess that whole units might disappear without cause or explanation, would be to admit weakness. Better to rewrite the records, to blame deserters or disease, than to leave the mystery intact. The cover-ups may not prove conspiracy, but they prove fear, the fear of chaos, the fear of losing the narrative. And so the story of the lost soldiers of 1943 became a mirror. To families, it reflected grief. To soldiers, it reflected dread. To governments, it reflected insecurity. To researchers and storytellers, it reflected fascination, the lure of the unsolved. The story adapts itself to its listener, becoming whatever they fear or desire most. For some, it is proof of supernatural forces. For others, it is evidence of secret experiments. For still others, it is a parable of war's madness. The mystery survives not because of what happened, but because of what we imagine happened. Yet, in that very adaptability, lies another disturbing possibility. What if the mystery endures not because it was unsolvable, but because it was solved, just not in ways the world was ready to hear? What if the soldiers stumbled upon something so extraordinary, so dangerous, that the only response was to erase them entirely? Not simply to silence them, but to ensure they were never found. Some researchers point to parallels with ancient legends. Tales of armies swallowed by deserts go back thousands of years. Herodotus wrote of a Persian force that vanished in a sandstorm. never seen again. In Asia, stories abound of travelers who followed strange lights into forests, never to return. Slavic folklore speaks of rivers that sing to lure the unwary beneath their ice. Could the lost soldiers of 1943 be the modern echo of older patterns, a reminder that humanity has always brushed against forces it cannot explain? In the end, the most chilling thought may be this: perhaps the lost soldiers of 1943 did not vanish at all. Perhaps they are still out there, somewhere, unseen but not gone, buried beneath sand, swallowed by sea, frozen beneath rivers, or elsewhere, in places we cannot name. Perhaps their silence is not absence, but endurance, and perhaps one day, something will bring them back.
By the 1970s, the world had moved on from World War II, but the lost soldiers of 1943 refused to fade into history. Their names appeared in letters, their stories in whispers, their shadows in unexpected places. Academics, amateur historians, even self-proclaimed psychics all tried to claim the mystery. But the more people dug, the more contradictions they uncovered. It was as if the truth itself resisted capture, shifting shape each time it was approached. One of the most persistent investigators was Dr. Eleanor Marsh, a historian from Oxford, who stumbled across references to the disappearances while researching prisoner of war camps. What fascinated her was not only the absence of bodies, but the abundance of paperwork. Army records, quartermaster ledgers, supply requisitions, all showing men receiving rations, drawing pay, signing forms, and then suddenly stopping. The entries ended mid-sentence, like a story with its last page torn out. To Dr. Marsh, this suggested not a sudden battle or mass desertion, but a deliberate erasure. Someone had chosen to make them vanish from the written record just as surely as they had vanished from the physical world. She followed the paper trail across continents, from the National Archives in London to a forgotten depot in Alexandria, Egypt. There, in a warehouse filled with moldering crates, she found what she believed to be a missing link: sealed boxes labeled Field Reports, Restricted, 1943. Inside were reports from soldiers who claimed to have witnessed strange atmospheric conditions the night the regiment disappeared. One described the sky shimmering with green light, like the aurora borealis in the desert. Another spoke of a low humming sound that vibrated through the ground, rattling canteens and helmets. Within hours, the men were gone. Marsh later said that reading those reports made her hands shake because they suggested that the event was not merely human in origin. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a retired U.S. Navy technician named Robert Delaney told a different story. He claimed that during the 1940s, he had worked on radar experiments in the Pacific, experiments that involved powerful electromagnetic fields. One night, his team allegedly tracked a blip an entire group of men before the signal blinked out as though swallowed by static. Delaney believed the lost engineers of the Solomon Islands were not victims of nature, but collateral damage in a classified military test. His claims were dismissed as fantasy, but they gained traction when fragments of declassified documents revealed references to experimental energy fields in the same region and year. For the Soviet case, the trail was even murkier. In the 1980s, defectors smuggled out notes from classified archives that mentioned Unit 47 disappeared. Presumed desertion, files closed. Yet attached to these notes were odd photographs, a snow-covered camp, empty tents, and strange patterns etched into the ice. The defectors claimed the photos were part of an investigation into phenomena Soviet scientists could not explain. Some suggested magnetic anomalies. Others speculated about portals or rifts in space. Whatever the truth, the images showed one chilling fact. The men had left without a fight. Their rifles were still stacked neatly. Their boots, in some cases, were still by the fires. It was as if they had simply stood up and walked into the void. By this time, the story of the lost soldiers had left the realm of history and entered popular culture. Tabloid newspapers ran headlines like "Vanished Battalion, Found on Alien World," and "Cursed Regiment Still Marches in the Desert." Filmmakers dramatized the disappearances, turning them into supernatural thrillers. Novelists wove them into tales of time travel, and parallel universes. Yet amid the sensationalism, families of the missing men still waited for answers. For them, this was not entertainment but unresolved grief. Every rumor, every theory was a reminder that their loved ones had been taken by something no one could explain. The 1990s brought a new dimension: technology. As satellite imaging advanced, researchers began scanning the deserts of North Africa, the jungles of the Pacific, and the tundra of Russia for anomalies. In 1998, a team studying the Sahara discovered a massive geometric formation buried beneath the sand near where the British unit had disappeared. Some thought it was a natural rock formation. Others insisted it was man-made, perhaps even the remnants of a structure predating human history. Theories exploded, linking it to the vanishings, as if the soldiers had stumbled into something ancient and forbidden. In the Pacific, sonar scans of the ocean floor near the Solomon Islands revealed what looked like unnatural depressions, pits, or craters at depths too precise to be accidental. Some interpreted them as evidence of wartime bombing. Others whispered of experiments that tore holes in the sea itself. The lost engineers were said to have been swallowed not by water, but by something far stranger. Russia, too, yielded its secrets. Satellite images of the region where the Soviet soldiers vanished showed unusual magnetic fluctuations. Compasses spun in circles, GPS signals failed. Local villagers spoke of strange lights in the sky, of animals disappearing without trace. To this day, the site is avoided, a place where even hunters will not tread. All of these findings rekindled the mystery, but they also raised a new question. Were these disappearances unique to 1943, or part of a larger pattern? Digging into history, researchers found disturbing parallels. A Roman legion reportedly vanished in Scotland centuries earlier, leaving behind shields, but no men. In the 13th century, a Mongol detachment was said to have disappeared in a blizzard, never found despite weeks of searching. In 1915, during World War I, the famous Sandringham Company of the Norfolk Regiment reportedly marched into the fog at Gallipoli and never returned. The stories, though scattered across centuries and continents, shared the same core: men vanishing as if erased by the world itself. And here lies the unsettling thought. What if the lost soldiers of 1943 were not an isolated incident, but simply the latest chapter in an ongoing phenomenon, one that transcends nations, wars, and even time itself? What if armies from Rome to Russia have always risked marching too close to the thin places in reality, where the veil between worlds is fragile and easily torn? For Dr. Marsh and others who devoted their lives to the puzzle, the disappearances became more than a mystery. They became an obsession, a haunting reminder that even in an age of science and technology, some truths remain untouchable. When asked late in her career what she believed had happened, Marsh gave a cryptic reply: "They went where others have gone before them, and where others will go again." Her words unsettled her students, because they implied that disappearance was not only possible, but inevitable, that somewhere out there, beyond the reach of reason, men were still vanishing into the dark. By the early 2000s, the legend of the lost soldiers of 1943 had woven itself into the fabric of global folklore. They were no longer just British, American, or Soviet ghosts. They had become universal symbols of mankind's most haunting question: what lies beyond the known? Television documentaries aired reenactments of the vanishings, complete with dramatic music and actors marching into fog, never to be seen again. Websites sprang up, each claiming to have found the truth, from alien abductions to secret Nazi experiments. Online forums buzzed with theories, some written by serious researchers, others by conspiracy theorists hungry for mystery. The age of the internet had given the story new life, and suddenly millions of people were invested in a mystery that had gone unsolved for nearly 60 years. But amid the noise, some serious investigations continued. In 2003, a joint Anglo-American archaeological expedition was launched in the Libyan desert, close to the area where the British regiment was said to have disappeared. Using ground-penetrating radar, the team uncovered what appeared to be a massive underground cavern system. The cavern stretched for miles beneath the sand, untouched for thousands of years. At first, the discovery was hailed as a triumph of archaeology, but then came the whispers. The expedition found personal effects scattered deep within the caverns. Buttons from uniforms, scraps of fabric, a rusted bayonet. The items were dated to the early 1940s. Yet strangely, there were no skeletons, no trace of bodies. It was as though the soldiers had passed through, but never remained. Scientists attempted to explain the find as natural sinkholes swallowing the men whole, but skeptics asked the obvious question: why were their belongings scattered while the men themselves had vanished without a trace? The Solomon Islands offered a different mystery. In 2008, divers exploring one of the underwater craters reported something astonishing: twisted fragments of metal embedded in the seabed. The fragments bore markings consistent with Allied equipment from the 1940s, but like the desert cavern, there were no human remains. More bizarre still, the divers reported that their compasses spun wildly and their electronic equipment malfunctioned whenever they neared the crater. One diver described it as like swimming into a storm that wasn't there. Meanwhile, Russia's frozen wilderness remained stubbornly enigmatic. In 2011, satellite thermal imaging revealed inexplicable hot spots beneath the permafrost where the Soviet unit had vanished. Teams sent to investigate found nothing but silence and snow. Local folklore, however, had its own explanation. Elders of the Iwinki people spoke of the hunger of the sky, a force that sometimes descended and claimed entire groups, leaving behind only their tools. To them, the fate of the soldiers was simply another chapter in a story older than Russia itself. By now, three separate mysteries, the desert, the jungle, and the tundra, were beginning to look less like coincidences and more like interconnected events. The theory of thin places, long dismissed as superstition, suddenly reemerged. Scholars argued that the Earth might have locations where the veil between worlds was fragile, where entire groups could slip away if they wandered too close. These places were scattered across the globe, appearing and disappearing like shifting tides. And perhaps 1943 was simply the year when three such rifts had opened simultaneously, swallowing soldiers from three different armies. This theory gained an eerie boost in 2015, when satellite anomalies recorded a spike in geomagnetic activity across the same three regions. The deserts of Libya, the waters of the Solomon Islands, and the Siberian tundra all experienced strange fluctuations at the exact same time. Lights were reported in the sky. Locals claimed to hear low, droning hums. And, disturbingly, a modern Russian patrol operating near the Siberian site reported losing contact with two men for several hours. The men returned shaken, unable to explain where they had been. Their watches had stopped. Their radios had burned out. To some, this was proof that the phenomenon was still active, that whatever had claimed the soldiers of 1943 was not finished. For families of the lost, these revelations were bittersweet. The possibility that their loved ones had been victims of forces beyond comprehension offered neither closure nor peace. "It's worse than death," said the granddaughter of one missing British private. "Death has a body, a grave, a ritual. This is like they were stolen by the universe itself." Still, the allure of the unknown persisted. In 2019, a documentary crew retraced the paths of all three vanishings. In Libya, they filmed shifting sands covering the entrances to the caverns, as though the desert itself resisted their intrusion. In the Solomon Islands, their cameras captured eerie interference whenever pointed at the craters. In Siberia, their drones malfunctioned mid-flight, crashing into the snow. The footage became a viral sensation, reigniting public fascination. Yet for all the drama, no answers came. And so the mystery deepened. Were the soldiers victims of natural disasters, sinkholes, tidal surges, blizzards? Were they erased by human hands, secret experiments, cover-ups, classified technologies? Or were they something else, entirely unwilling travelers into another world, caught in a net of physics we cannot yet understand? Whatever the explanation, one fact remains undeniable. 3 groups of men from 3 nations at war vanished in the same year without a trace. In a conflict defined by millions of deaths, their absence should have been a footnote. But instead it became a wound in history, a silence that refuses to heal. And perhaps that is the true power of the story. In an age when we believe we can map every corner of the earth, the lost soldiers remind us that mysteries still exist, that there are still shadows deep enough to swallow whole armies. Their story is a mirror held up to humanity's deepest fear, the fear of vanishing, of being forgotten, of leaving behind nothing but questions. As one modern historian put it, we want to believe we own the world. The lost soldiers prove we do not. By the time the second decade of the 21st century drew to a close, the legend of the lost soldiers had taken on an almost mythic quality. For some, it was a story of tragedy. For others, a riddle that refused to die. Governments issued no new statements. Archives remained silent, and yet the voices demanding answers grew louder. Each new generation rediscovered the mystery and asked the same question that haunted those who had lived through the war. Where did they go? It was during this period that independent researcher David Klein made what many consider the most provocative claim yet. Klein, a physicist with a background in quantum mechanics, suggested that the vanishings could be explained not by folklore or extraterrestrial intervention, but by the Earth itself. He argued that under rare and poorly understood conditions, the planet's geomagnetic field could act as a kind of natural trapdoor. When certain atmospheric and geological factors aligned, a temporary rupture in space-time could occur. If a group happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong moment, they might simply slip through. His theory was scoffed at by mainstream science, yet it resonated with the public. After all, hadn't satellites already detected anomalies in the same regions? Hadn't countless witnesses described strange lights, sounds, and compass errors? Klein's work, published in 2021, breathed new life into the debate. Suddenly, the soldiers weren't just war victims. They were potential pioneers, accidental travelers into realms beyond human comprehension. But while some welcomed this vision of a cosmic explanation, others feared it. If Klein was right, then the phenomenon might not be confined to 1943. It could happen again. The notion that the Earth itself could swallow people whole without warning was a terrifying prospect. And indeed, strange disappearances in remote areas continued to fuel speculation. A group of hikers missing in Siberia, divers lost in the Pacific, nomads gone without trace in the Sahara. Were these tragedies random accidents or echoes of 1943? Parallel to Klein's scientific approach was the work of cultural historians who studied the stories surrounding the lost soldiers. They found an unsettling pattern. In every culture, in every age, there were tales of people stepping into the unknown and never returning. The Celts spoke of misty gateways to the otherworld. The Japanese told of kami, who lured men into forests from which they never emerged. The Native Americans warned of sacred places where spirits consumed trespassers. The similarities were too striking to ignore. It was as if humanity had always known that thin places existed, long before science gave them names. And the soldiers of 1943 had simply become the most modern and the most documented victims of an ancient truth. Still, the human element could not be forgotten. Families of the missing men continued to fight for recognition. In Britain, descendants of the vanished regiment lobbied for a memorial. They argued that, regardless of the mystery, the men had served and should be honored. In America, veterans groups pushed for declassification of naval records from the Solomon Islands, insisting that the truth, whatever it was, had been buried too long. In Russia, however, the subject remained taboo, wrapped in layers of silence. Officially, the soldiers had deserted. Unofficially, their story was whispered about with unease, as though acknowledging it might awaken something best left sleeping. For storytellers, the case became a canvas. Films, novels, and podcasts drew millions of listeners and viewers. Some painted the soldiers as tragic victims of war's chaos. Others portrayed them as heroes transported to another dimension, fighting an eternal battle in some shadowy world. A few dared to imagine them alive, descendants still walking in hidden lands, forgotten by history but not by fate. Yet behind the creativity lingered a chilling reality. No matter how the tale was told, the central question remained unanswered. The soldiers were gone, and nothing had ever explained how or why. In 2022, a breakthrough seemed possible. A multinational team of researchers announced that they had located what they believed to be a residual anomaly in the Libyan desert. Using sensitive instruments, they detected fluctuations in magnetic fields exactly where the regiment had disappeared. The readings were unlike anything previously recorded, unstable, and eerily similar to Klein's predictions. For a brief moment, hope surged that the mystery might finally yield, but the optimism did not last. Within weeks, the project was abruptly shut down. Funding was pulled. Data vanished from public databases. The official explanation cited equipment malfunction, but insiders claimed something else. One anonymous source stated that the instruments had not simply malfunctioned. They had recorded a pulse of energy so strong it nearly destroyed them. Whatever took those men, the source said, is still active, and it doesn't want to be studied. The statement was never confirmed, but it spread like wildfire. Some dismissed it as conspiracy mongering. Others saw it as proof that the soldiers' fate remained locked in a secret too dangerous to reveal. And so the silence returned. Government said nothing. Scientists moved on. Families grew older, their memories fading. But the mystery endured, refusing to die. It lived in books, in documentaries, in late-night conversations between those who dared to ask what others avoided. Perhaps that is why the story matters so deeply. The lost soldiers of 1943 remind us of the fragility of certainty. We like to think the world is mapped, measured, and explained. We like to believe that nothing truly vanishes without cause. But their story shatters that illusion. It forces us to confront the possibility that some truths lie beyond reach, that some questions remain unanswered, not because we haven't tried hard enough, but because reality itself withholds the answer. And so the question lingers, heavy as ever. Where did they go? Did they stumble into a rift, a place where time and space folded in on themselves? Were they victims of human ambition, lost in experiments never meant to exist? Or are they still out there, somewhere just beyond sight, waiting in a world we cannot see? Whatever the case, their footsteps echo through history. Their absence is louder than presence, a silence that has lasted for 8 decades. And as long as it lasts, the world will wonder. The mystery of the lost soldiers of 1943 has outlived almost everyone who once searched for them. Veterans who remembered their names are gone. Families who waited by the door in hope have passed on. And yet the story endures past like a torch from one generation to the next. It survives because it asks a question that touches something primal in all of us. What if vanishing, without warning, without explanation, could happen to anyone? In recent years, a small but dedicated group of researchers has tried to keep the search alive. They call themselves the Watchers. Formed in 2025, the group includes physicists, former military officers, and amateur historians. Their mission is not only to uncover the truth, but also to monitor regions where the phenomenon might reappear. They share data quietly, away from the noise of mainstream media, wary of drawing too much attention. Their guiding principle is simple. If the earth has doors, someone needs to keep watch when they open. One of their most startling claims came in 2027, when the Watchers published a report suggesting a pattern. According to their data, every 80 years, there is a spike in geomagnetic anomalies in 3 specific regions of the world: the Libyan desert, the Solomon Islands, and Siberia. The last major spike? 1943. The next predicted spike? 2023 to 2027. If they are correct, the phenomenon that swallowed the soldiers could soon stir again. The report sent ripples of fear and fascination across online communities. Were the lost soldiers of 1943 a warning, not just a mystery? Were they proof that the earth itself opens and closes like a living thing, consuming groups at intervals? And if so, what would happen if another regiment, another patrol, another expedition wandered too close during the next cycle? Skeptics dismissed the theory as numerology, a coincidence born of overanalyzed data. But believers pointed to recent events: hikers vanishing in the Gobi Desert, a research submarine disappearing without trace in the Pacific, hunters lost in Siberia. None of these cases were proven to be connected, but the echoes were enough to spark unease. And so the legend of the soldiers is no longer just a question of the past. It has become a question of the future. What if 1943 was not an isolated event, but the beginning of a cycle? What if others will vanish as they did, swallowed by the same silence? The Watchers remain vigilant. They say that when the desert winds rise unnaturally, when the sea hums with static, when the tundra glows faintly beneath the stars, one should remember 1943, because the lost soldiers are not just gone, they are waiting for us to notice, waiting for us to follow. The chilling part is this: no theory, no investigation, no declassified file has ever been able to account for the most human detail of all. When soldiers vanish, they leave behind more than equipment or footprints. They leave behind unfinished stories, letters never sent, promises never kept, futures never lived. Their absence is not only a hole in the battlefield, but in the fabric of families, in the rhythm of history itself. Some believe they died quickly, swallowed by forces they could never understand. Others believe they live still, displaced in a place where time moved differently, their uniforms still fresh, their boots still marching. Perhaps in some parallel dawn, they wake each morning and wonder why rescue never came. Perhaps they too tell stories of us, the world they left behind, as a legend, a memory fading into myth. And here is where history gives way to imagination, because maybe the truth is stranger than any of us dare to accept. Maybe the lost soldiers did not go somewhere else. Maybe they are still here, around us, but hidden in folds of reality our eyes cannot pierce. Maybe when we feel sudden chills, when compasses spin without reason, When we sense we are being watched in the emptiest of places, it is them. Still marching, still searching, still lost. For decades, humanity has sought closure, but perhaps closure was never meant to come. Perhaps their story is not about answers, but about questions that humble us, that remind us of how little we know. The soldiers of 1943 vanished, and in doing so, they gave us something far more enduring than certainty. They gave us mystery, and in that mystery lies both fear and wonder. So the next time you find yourself in a place where silence feels heavy, where shadows stretch too far, or where the wind seems to whisper, remember this. Once, in 1943, men walked into such silence and never returned. Their boots left no trail. Their voices left no echo. They became part of something larger than war, larger than history itself. And until the day the world finds them or follows them, the question will remain, where did they go? The truth about the lost soldiers of 1943 is only the beginning. What we uncovered next makes this mystery look almost ordinary, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. Hit subscribe with the bell icon, because the next video reveals a cover-up so massive it could rewrite what World War II. Until then, what's your theory? Write it below. I'm watching the comments closely.